Introduce our guest this evening, Dustman. And if you have not taken her tour of Silver Mountain City, she does it usually every fall, September, October. This is an on-the-ground tour. You will get an overview, but it's really neat to go there and actually see where these buildings sat. And you'll be shocked to find out where they are, because if you've ever driven Highway 4, you probably passed them. But you don't want to miss the tour, because they really go to a lot of work. They label everything so you can see it, and we walk along the road, and Rick saves us from being run over. That's Karen's husband. He's her assistant, does a really good job. Now I'd like to talk to you a little about Karen and her book, but I want to talk to you about some other things. You've probably read other items that she's written for the Record Courier. If you remember the picture of Markleyville that was discovered, painted before the fire, and I can't remember which fire, 1885 fire. She wrote a really good article about that. And the witness tree that all of us, Rick, Karen, myself, and Judy, a friend, went out and found in Diamond Valley. And so they're kind of history nuts, just like I am. We spend a lot of time together investigating things, but her book on Silver Mountain City is fantastic. She has a few copies here tonight. You need to get one, and we need to get some more in our store. She has several other books. She's written one of a driving tour of Diamond Valley, just down the road a little to the south. She's done some biographies of some local people, and she's working right now on a tour of Markleyville. So, and they're just real close neighbors. So we need to go to their museum in the summertime when it's open, and they will come to ours. So it's a nice connection. But I want to turn it over now to Karen to give you a really good tour of Silver Mountain City. Come on.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to see so many people who are interested in Silver Mountain City. It's amazing to me that this many people even know what Silver Mountain City is. So how many of you have ever been there before? Do you know where it is? For those of you who don't know, it's past Markleyville on Highway 4. And you in Nevada have the Comstock Lode, and we in Alpine County had Silver Mountain City. This was the town that put Alpine County on the map, and it was supposed to be the next Comstock Lode, never quite made it, but we're going to give you a little tour of Silver Mountain and what's left of it and what used to be there today. It's kind of funny in a way, as I was thinking about putting this together, it's funny in a way that I'm here and talking to you about history, because history was always something when I was in high school that I just hated. It was names and dates and places, and it was one of those really testable subjects, what happened in 1492, and it was never about the people. And as I got older and learned about the people in my own family, of course, the people stories are the really interesting parts of history. And when Rick and I moved here to the Carson Valley about 2001, we drove by Silver Mountain City, and we knew that something was there, and it sort of piqued our interest, but we didn't really know what it was. And I was lucky enough to get a job working in the DA's office up in Alpine County, which was right next to the library, and started going over on my lunch hour and pouring through the newsreels. And all of a sudden, all the stories and the people started to come to life. So Silver Mountain City feels like a real place to me at this point. I hope that I can convey some of that, some of the people stories to you tonight. If you've been to Silver Mountain City, this is what it looks like today.
Yes.
And when we started researching it, we really found that nobody had written about the town at all in any depth. There were a little bit of information available, there wasn't very much. What we wound up doing in terms of finding documents largely was about, I can see here, see my notes a little bit? I can see barely. Can we have a little more light? Okay.
You want this?
That's better, thank you.
That's not good.
Yeah, here we go. Okay. There we go. A little self-help here. That'll work. Okay. So how we learned about the town itself was largely from the records, the tax records, the tax rolls, the documents. We're very fortunate to have a great collection in Lockline County archives about that, and most of all from the newspapers. I'm going to take you back in time just a little bit. This is what Silver Mountain City looked like about 1876. You can see at the time the town was kind of falling into disrepair. There might still be some people in the far distance down the road, and as you can see, there's still some wagon tracks. It looks like it's still being used, but it's definitely a town that's seen better days. If you look closely at that building on the left, the one with the false front, that was probably the toll keeper's station, as you'll see in the very next slide. And this was Silver Mountain City in its heyday, about 1864. If you'd entered town that time, you would have been coming from the left of the picture to the right, so you would have been coming into town over the Big Tree Toll Road. And that was the toll gate. See that there's a sign hanging over the road. If you're able to zoom in a little better than this picture, you would see that it was the Carson, the Big Tree Carson Toll Road, and that was in fact the toll keeper's station on the left with the same false front that you saw before. It's a freshly minted mining town with construction still going on at this point, and it would have taken you 5 or 6 days to get here coming from Murphy's, especially in the wintertime. One of the things that I thought was especially fun as I was researching was reading some of the old letters, so I'd like to read you a little piece of one of the letters which will give you a flavor for what it took to get to Silver Mountain City back then. This is from a traveler named George Meade, who wrote home describing his trip to Silver Mountain in January of 1864, and he writes, "Dear Mother, I started from San Jose all alone, except for the company of my horse. Rode 30 miles the first day, 45 miles the second, which put me to Stockton. And next morning I started out late and stopped at the North American House, a very fine place built right on the mountains. And on the 25th, rode over 35 miles over the mountains alone, not a person to be seen on the road except myself. On the 27th, I passed the big trees you've heard so much about. They are monsters. I started on and came to a small house in the woods, stopped and went in, and then wished myself out again, for I was a little afraid. Those were the roughest looking men I had ever seen, and they were all drunk. I stayed there about 10 minutes, bid them good day and left, and felt much easier when I was outdoors. The place where I stayed all night was called Big Meadows, which would be today's Kirkwood. Found a trapper there, keeping house all alone 9 miles from any neighbor, and he was as glad to see me as he would have been to see a brother. And in the morning I started on foot, leading the pony, with snow in places 2 and 3 feet deep. Finally, after going 4 or 5 miles, the snow became so deep I could hardly get through. I thought I would soon be through the worst of it and kept urging the pony along until she was all cut up and the snow got so deep I had to leave her and go on foot for help. After waiting in the snow about 2 hours, I came to a small cabin and found 2 trappers. I told them if they would get the pony out of the snow, I would give them the whole rig, pony, saddle, and bridle. One of them accepted the rig, and I was left to finish my journey on foot. The next place where I stopped was the dirtiest place I ever saw. The man looked as if he hadn't seen water for 5 months, and the thoughts of him as cook was almost enough to sicken anyone. I lived through it, but I can't say I like that style of living. In the evening, when we were eating supper, we heard hollering, and we hollered back, and soon 4 men came in, almost used up from the deep snow. In the morning, we made ourselves snowshoes, which is the same as skis, and started on. It was 10 miles to Mr. Ritchie's house in Hermit Valley. When we got within 2 miles of it, it commenced snowing, but luckily it was downhill all the way. The snowshoes I had were 8 feet long, 4 inches wide, and turned up like a sleigh runner. And going downhill, they ran so fast I couldn't keep my balance. Of course, I rolled a good share of the way with 30 pounds packed on my back. In the night, the snow fell another 25 inches, and so we had to lay over an extra day. On Sunday, we started early with just 20 miles left to go. The first 6 were up the mountains, and we only made about a mile an hour for the first 5 hours with the snow 5 feet deep. Finally, we got through, all of us safe, but very tired. I thought of home very often while on the mountains and thought if I ever got over safe, I would never undertake to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter again. My love to all, from your son, George. So this would be the bustling town that George was coming to see, and this is what it looked like in 1867. There were perhaps 1,000 people living here then at its height, and you're looking from the lower right corner up to the upper left is sort of toward the east. Travelers would have entered the town over the Big Tree Road coming in from the right. And what brought them here was silver. The first strikes at Silver Mountain were made about 1861, and by 1863 the town was alive with prospectors. As I've already said, this was the hope of a second Comstock load that brought them. A contemporary described it, a general rush was made from Virginia and other mining camps to the new El Dorado, and buildings of all kind were erected in anxious haste. Saloons drove a rushing trade, and corner lots ruled high. By the fall of 1863, townsfolk decided they wanted to form their own county rather than have to do business over the mountains with Jackson as the county seat. A petition was circulated, and in March 1864, the Alpine Bill passed, carving out a 723 square mile Alpine County out of the 5 neighboring counties. And from a lawyer's point of view, to have legislation go through so quickly, to circulate a petition in September and then have a bill be passable in March is just amazing. These were the mining districts that were formed in Alpine County, and as you can see, that one at the bottom is the Silver Mountain District, and then just up and to the right of that is Monitor District, and those were the 2 primary mining districts in the new Alpine County. In 1864, none other than the local district judge, Theron Reed, drew this map of the mining districts. You can see, I don't know how clearly you can see it, the dotted line from the lower left going kind of diagonally across the picture is the Big Tree Road. And that was clearly marked on it was a prominent feature, obviously, on the landscape, and it made it onto the map. The cluster of mines are little dots, again, I'm not sure how well you can see it in the back, but you can see the names up on the left and the right, and that was just some of the different mines that were staked and claimed here. There were literally hundreds of mines that were staked in this period of time. As one contemporary wrote, eager prospectors covered the mountainsides, swarmed around the immediate vicinity of the pioneer discovery, and almost before the year 1861 expired, nothing was left in the shape of a ledge or a stain or an outcrop to be located, every single ledge being taken up 2 or 3 times over by a rude notice on its spurs or angles. With all that, however, little useful work was done after the first coyote hole was made to hold the ground. The first groups of hopeful prospectors arrived on foot or by mule train, like this fellow on the left. As we've said, the Big Tree Road already came partway from Murphy's, extending as far as Hermit Valley and the border of Ruffian Pass in 1857. And when Silver Mountain's mining excitement began, travelers naturally wanted a much easier way to get to town. James Sperry got the road franchise in 1862 to extend the Big Tree Road all the way to Silver Mountain City. And by 1863, 100 men were hard at work building the road. A full year later, the roadway was completed, allowing stage travel, the gentleman on the right there, to reach Silver Mountain. A toll road was also finished about the same time coming from the other direction from Markleyville. Once both roads were passable, stage services sprang up to take advantage of the new rush of people coming to town. I love this picture. This is from an old book, and it sort of gives you a feeling of what it must have been like to ride stagecoaches in those days. In addition to being very expensive, stage travel could be pretty unpleasant. It was dusty, it was dirty, and it was very dangerous. But bit by bit, thanks to sweating road crews, the roads were gradually improved. And by 1876, newspaperman Robert Folger was able to brag about zooming from Silver Mountain to Bear Valley in only 8 hours in a light one-horse buggy. This is a map that we drew of Silver Mountain itself, just to give you some general idea of the lay of the land. If you've been up there and you've seen the old jail site, that's marked as the star in the kind of middle right area. And so the rest of this talk, we're going to sort of take you on a virtual walking tour along Main Street. So we're going to start at the Star, and then we're going to go down Main Street, staying on the bottom half of Main Street to where First Street intersects at the far left, and then we're going to cross the street and then come back, so we'll hit most of those high points. That'll orient you a little bit. As you can see, the town was laid out 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Street, 5th Street. And there were also houses, mostly houses and homes on Union and Bluff Street, a little bit on Water Street. One of the joys of our research was putting together this map. And when I say joy, it was kind of like a puzzle, because we had an 1877 map which had the streets marked on it, but the numbering system didn't coincide with what I was finding in the property records. You could tell that it wasn't really right, because it would say a lot and block, and the lots of blocks would be like way up on the mountainside someplace, and the numbering system was all off. And eventually we figured out from the records what had to be, which lot and which block would locate some of the businesses. We were lucky enough to have advertisements that would say the corner of 1st and Main, or the corner of 4th and Union, or something like that. And then there would also be sometimes property descriptions that would give you the block number. It would say it was between 3rd and 4th and Union and Main, and you'd know, okay, that's that block. But it was really a puzzle to put together, so that was kind of fun. Again, if you've been up there recently, this picture is from about 1940, but the jail looks somewhat similar to that today. This was the one remaining landmark, which also gave us our bearing on the ground, was the old stone jail. Take a look at this picture closely, and you'll notice there's not very many trees nearby, although there are trees starting to grow on the edges of the slopes. And this is what it looks like today. You notice it has a chain link fence around it, and the walls have gotten pushed over a little bit. But look at the size of the trees. It's amazing how much they've grown up in 60 or 70 years. These are all second growth trees. All of the trees in the area were logged off originally, both for building timber and obviously for firewood. One of the offhand remarks that the newspaper editors made at the newspaper one winter in 1870 was, "We have burned 17 cords of wood this winter, and it's lucky for us, the long and warm days are at hand." So if you can imagine 17 cords of wood, and that was just one business. Temperatures in the winter here could dip as low as 12 below zero, and the buildings were largely uninsulated. Directly across from where the jail sits today is this site, which is Pete Peterson's house, facing Water Street. And there's just a little indentation in the ground if you're up there, and if you ever come on our tour, we'll take you here. Pete Peterson met his untimely end around New Year's Day of 1878. A native of Norway, he ended his life here in a rather unusual way at the young age of 53, in what might have been a post-New Year's stupor. The newspaper reported his demise rather matter-of-factly under the headline, "Found Dead, a Sad End." About 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, that would have been January 2nd of 1878, the dead body of Peter Peterson, an old and well-known resident of this town, was found lying in front of his cabin on Water Street. An examination showed that the face had been terribly mutilated by hogs. The hogs had eaten into his neck and cut the jugular, the head lying in a pool of blood. It is supposed that he had gone home intoxicated and had fallen where found, the key of his cabin being found near him. He was probably stunned by the fall or fell asleep, when he was attacked by a hog, cutting the jugular vein, causing him to bleed to death. The deceased was a good-hearted man whose strong drink has been his greatest vice for some time past. They held a coroner's inquest, and they found that poor Peter had indeed died falling from the steps of his cabin in a state of intoxication. The funeral took place the next day and was conducted by the local Reverend R.H. Ford, who we'll meet later on in this tour. Just imagine the state of the town to have roving bands of hogs on its streets. This story also shows that by 1878, Silver Mountain City was not very well populated, as his body was not even found until 10 o'clock the next morning. Just down Main Street a little bit farther was the Occidental Saloon. While the jail and Pete Peterson's home were facing 4th Street, the Occidental was a little bit farther to the west between 3rd and 4th. And as you can see, this saloon was adjoining the courthouse. But the courthouse wasn't what we think of as a court. This was Mayans Exchange, and this picture was a great find. One of the things that was really fun was looking for old pictures of Silver Mountain. There are a few left, but finding the hidden treasure was really a treasure. And this one happened to be on the web. I was able to pull it up from, I think it was the California State Library records, and it was kind of buried. It wasn't something that you would just jump out when you searched for Silver Mountain. But this one was a real find. It was, you can see, it was a 3-story building. It was built in 1864, and it was one of the most prominent buildings in town. Known as Mayans Exchange, this was one of the town's popular watering holes, probably right after it was built in 1864. A visitor that year wrote in his journal about going downtown to Billy Ryan's Exchange, which was said to be the most valuable property in Silver Mountain. Ryan's featured a nightlife liberally laced with cider, lager, cigars, and games of billiards. Court was not an everyday event in Silver Mountain. The district court met just twice a year, and the local county court 3 times a year. And court week was considered especially good for business by hotel and saloon keepers because it brought more people to town. So rather than build a separate court building, the county economically just rented space in this building from W.H. Ryan for the occasion. This was a lucrative contract for the building owner, $195 a year in 1864, and it jumped to $360 for 1867. And while court happened to be going on at Ryan's, the site conveniently still functioned as a saloon. Understandably, competition ensued to become the county's courthouse, and in early 1866, the nearby Mammoth Hotel proposed renting its rooms to serve as courthouse instead. Court was later moved to another saloon building in 1871, Ogden Saloon, which we'll see later, who offered it to the county rent-free. I guess the business was good enough, he didn't have to make money on the rent. Down the street from Ryan's was Swinnerton's Hardware Store, also known as the Pioneer Hardware Store, a true general store. And merchandise here could be purchased including stoves, hardware, crockery, paint, and anything you need for mining, from tools, rope, powder, and fuse, or even if you needed a door or a window, Swinnerton's was the place to go. It's actually amazing that such a wide variety of supplies were so readily available in such a remote spot as Silver Mountain. Supplies had to be hauled a long distance by wagon to get there from either Sacramento, Stockton, or Carson City. And in later years, they went as far as Reno by rail, but they still had to be hauled by a freight wagon and stage to get to Silver Mountain. Goods might come over the Big Tree Road from the west or through Markleyville, but either way it took a toll road to get here. And as a result, goods were pretty expensive. In 1864, you could buy a pair of duck overalls for $2.25, or a pair of boots for $7. By comparison, an average miner might expect to make just $3 or $4 a day. Swinnerton's Hardware Store building would actually become infamous in 1882 when a fire started here in a stovepipe, which wiped out a good bit of whatever was left of Silver Mountain City. Lewis Chalmers, one of the local mining capitalists, wrote, "Last Saturday, the town of Silver Mountain was almost annihilated by fire. The post office, the postmaster's house are in ashes, and the postmaster, Mr. Ford, has gone to Markleyville." Among the buildings that were destroyed, were the beautiful Ryan's Exchange and a number of other saloons, a livery stable, a barn, and several houses. As Chalmers' letter points out, one of the longtime hotels which burned here in the fire was Ford's Hotel, which we'll also visit later on in this virtual tour. By an amazing stroke of luck, however, by the time of this 1882 fire, the official Alpine County seat had been moved to Markleeville, along with its official records. So, amazingly, many of Alpine County's original property tax, mining, and other records have survived to this day. What good luck managed to preserve, however, well-meaning government bureaucrats almost destroyed. About 40 years ago, the county decided it was time to get rid of much of its old paper, and all kinds of documents were hauled to the dump. Thankfully, some sharp-eyed citizens rescued many of the documents from the pile and saved them, but a number did go up in smoke. Just down the street, next door to Swinnerton's, was Davidson's Saloon on the corner of 3rd. Right next door to Swinnerton's was the bustling saloon at the very heart of downtown, and the real estate would have been very pricey here. Prime commercial lots in the vicinity cost as much as $1,000 a rep, and as a result, Davidson and Swinnerton split a lot. So instead of a 50-foot wide parcel, they only had 25 feet wide each. And this was actually fairly common. Farther away from Main Street, a residential lot to build your home could cost you $50. Homes in the early days could be log cabins, rude shacks, or even tents, and they were not always terribly well built. In 1864, one visitor noted in his diary, "Awfully windy day, blew down several houses." The J stood for James Davidson, and like Lewis Chalmers, Davidson came from a Scottish family. Davidson was an active member of the local community, serving on the Silver Mountain Christmas Festival Committee and on the Board of Education, and he also figured prominently, as you'll hear, in one of the sadder passages of Alpine County history, becoming the person who was in charge of taking a prisoner named Ernst Roosh down to Mono County for trial in 1874, a trial that never happened, as we'll see. But by 1878, it appears Davidson had left town. There was a delinquent tax notice against his saloon. I mentioned that he was a prominent member of the Christmas Festival, and Christmas was a huge event in Silver Mountain every year. Everybody in town got together. The women would get together to plan the festivities. The men would help decorate the hall. They would always include at least one and sometimes two big Christmas trees with presents for everyone in town underneath. Gifts might include such things as a handmade pair of skis, which was a primary way for people to get around town if you stayed there in the wintertime. People would also bring baked goods and wine to the editors of the Chronicle newspaper. On the opposite corner of 3rd Street, across from Davidson's, stood Gates Drug Store. And in 1865, this site contained not just a drugstore, but two other buildings as well, one of which was a saloon. Right behind the drugstore was a piece of property owned by a gentleman named DeWitt C. Riddell. And Riddell would be the first telegraph operator in town when the telegraph line was brought into Silver Mountain in 1864, probably in another building across the street. And he also served as Wells Fargo's agent for the town. At the time Gates' drugstore sat here, drugs were not regulated the way they are today. Residents could buy patent medicines with marvelous names like Dr. Ayer's Wonderful Cures or Richard's Remedy for Rheumatism. People would also use home remedies like whiskey to wash their sore feet, and would purchase herbs like bone sack, which was used to treat everything from tapeworms to indigestion. A wide variety of quack cures were also available by mail through the newspaper from Stockton or San Francisco. And mining entrepreneur Lewis Chalmers, whose picture is up at the upper right, ordered himself a bottle of hair restorer. You can see why. This is what, if you were to stop in today, this is what Gates' drugstore corner looks like today. It's hard to imagine that there was ever even a building here. And one of the things that you'll notice if you visit Silver Mountain is that some of the spots have quite deep depressions, while some are flat, like this one. The depressions are hand-dug cellars, and it was very common for stores or even homes or larger buildings to have a cellar as a place to keep goods, store merchandise, and for homes as a way to store potatoes and other root vegetables, and also to keep perishable food cool. But as you can see in this picture, not every building had a cellar. farther down Main Street, between 2nd and 3rd, was the stable known as Betchman's Stable, or the Silver Mountain Livery. Horses and wagons, of course, were a primary form of transportation, so a place for travelers to keep their horse or to hire a horse was very important. And every town in the area had at least one stable and often 2 or 3. In addition to these accommodations for horses, people also needed blacksmiths to make horseshoes, parts for wagon, fix wagon wheels. So blacksmiths were another important fixture in the town, and often these were conveniently located either in or right near the stable. Over the years, this Silver Mountain stable went through several owners. Frank Betchman operated the Silver Mountain livery here from about 1865 to 72, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of these gentlemen here in the picture is Frank, although we don't really know who he was. We call this the ghost dog picture, because as you can see, the aperture had to stay open longer than today's cameras, and you can see where the dog moved. Blacksmith J.J. Rice opened a blacksmith shop across the street, right behind the Chronicle newspaper office, about 1868. And we think he then purchased this livery stable building about 1873 and moved his blacksmith shop here. So another one of these gentlemen could very well be Rice. Rice himself was an interesting character in town, one of the longest residents of Silver Mountain City, and perhaps even its last inhabitant. Rice served as a private in the Mexican War at the age of 28. He was a miner in the town of Monitor in his early days in 1864. But by 1867, he moved here to Silver Mountain and had been sworn in as the town's constable. When local saloon keeper Eric Erickson was shot, Rice was one of the first to arrive on the scene and took custody of Erickson's body. About 1882, as the town of Silver Mountain was folding up, Rice moved to Genoa, and he died there in March of 1892. In his obituary, the newspaper called him the last inhabitant of Silver Mountain City. And that wasn't quite the end of his story. A rather bizarre newspaper story reported that while 2 of Rice's friends were bringing his body back from Genoa to be buried in Markletville, they managed to get lost in a snowstorm with his corpse in the back of the wagon. How would you like to be along on that wagon ride? Rice was eventually buried in the Markletville Cemetery, which to me is kind of a sad end for a longtime Silver Mountain resident. And this was Jacob Struben, who had a shoe shop near the stable. Struben was an immigrant from Switzerland, and he had a shop here as early as 1865. You'll remember that a pair of boots could cost $7 new, so you paid to get your shoes repaired when you could. But Struben wasn't just your humble cobbler. The 1870 census shows that he owned real property worth $500 and personal property valued at $800. He became a stockholder in one of the local mines known as the Ribbon, and he was a relocator who would claim rights in inactive or unworked mines. With partners, he speculated in buying and selling real estate, and he may have acted as a straw man for Chalmers. After Struben won a lawsuit over rights to the Fremont claim, he turned around and promptly sold it to Chalmers in 1872. This picture shows him how he looked about the time he lived in Silver Mountain in 1865. He died about 10 years later in San Francisco, about 1875. And it's kind of a sad picture to think he was a pretty young man at the time that he died. This was the Mammoth Hotel, the far west end of town. This large, blocky, 2-story building was probably the largest hotel in Silver Mountain. Built about 1864, the furniture for it alone cost $16,000. Next door in the west, which would be the low building closest to you, was a stable. And on the other side of the hotel was a meat market. So you can imagine the smells for the guests. This hotel was owned in the late 1860s by Eliza Eppinger. It was somewhat unusual for a woman to own real property at the time, and Eliza was never called by the usual honorific of Mrs., which was a little strange, so we wondered whether the Mammoth might have been conducting a different business of some kind on the side. By 1867, poor Eliza was delinquent on her taxes, and by 71, the Mammoth Hotel had become, as the newspaper called it, an eyesore. The Mammoth Stable, that building in front, was torn down about 1876, and the lumber was reincorporated in a boarding house at the IXL mine up the canyon. And that was pretty common to use lumber. Lumber was a precious commodity, cost a lot of money, it was hard to mill. So if the building was vacant, they could just tear it down and use the lumber somewhere else. And the far end of the block was a piece of real estate owned by Alpine County's infamous treasurer, Thomas Leggett. Thomas Leggett was one of the earliest Silver Mountain residents, showing up here as early as 1863. And he was a bit of a wheeler-dealer, helping to organize several early mining companies, including one known as the Silver Mountain Quarrying and Mining Company in September of 1863. And he also served as secretary for the Balaclava up in South Scandinavian Canyon. It had its headquarters at this site at the far west end of Silver Mountain City. Leggett became deputy treasurer for the county in 1868 and then ran for treasurer and won in 1870. And as you can see, he had another title too, and apparently another business on the side out of his treasurer's office. He would draw deeds and mortgages, and he served as a notary public. It soon became evident, even while he was treasurer, that there were a few little problems with his bookkeeping, however. Leggett was voted out of office in 1876, and he was supposed to be turning over the books and records to his successor, but he refused to do so, making it impossible for quite a while for people to obtain abstracts of title for their mining claims. A grand jury report later determined that he'd embezzled over $4,000 from the county treasury, an amount that would equate to about $100,000 in today's dollars. But before he could be prosecuted, he timely died in 1878 at the age of 61, so he did manage to escape prosecution. Chalmers, who was a fellow Scotsman, was friendly with Leggett. Leggett had acted as a straw man on occasion for Chalmers in transactions, buying in a saloon for him for taxes on Chalmers' behalf in 1869. And Chalmers apparently helped Leggett out too. After Leggett's death, the executor of Leggett's estate found a few checks written by Chalmers among Leggett's papers and apparently demanded payment. Chalmers, however, quickly explained, well, these weren't real checks. They were only there for bookkeeping purposes because for years, Leggett had been short of cash on counting day, and Chalmers had been in the habit of lending him checks to be shown as cash. Creative bookkeeping. So now we're at the far west end of Silver Mountain, and we're crossing the street to the north side of Main Street to reach Fisk's Hotel, directly across the street from Leggett's property. This was one of the most famous and long-lasting hotels in town. And this is what it looked like about the time that it was built by Charles Fisk in 1863. Next door on the right was the Bulletin, Silver Mountain's original newspaper office. And dinners here at the Fisk Hotel might include lavish oyster suppers. If you happen to be up there and look carefully on the ground, you can still see some of the oyster shells littered about. Rooms in this hotel would have been cold and drafty. The walls were a single board thickness. And winters here in Silver Mountain were anything but fun. Snow could be 3 to 5 feet on the level on Main Street. And one diary of a resident talks about a 7-foot snowfall in front of his front door. So you can imagine why the Fisk family was in the habit of leaving Silver Mountain for Murphy's every winter. The Fisk Hotel did manage to survive the devastating fire here at Silver Mountain in 1882. But in 1885, another great fire, this one in Markleyville, wiped out most of the town of Markleyville. And the Fisk Hotel was disassembled piece by piece and moved to Markleyville by A.M. Grover to become the Hot Spring Hotel for guests at his hot springs. And many of you know this building if you've been to Markleyville. This is the Fisk Hotel as it looks today, or the Cutthroat Saloon on the corner of Main and Montgomery in Markleyville. And so if you want, you can still walk inside this real Silver Mountain building, which is kind of a neat feeling. This is what the site of Fisk's Hotel would look like if you were up there. It's a little hard to see in this picture, but there's a blue dot on that tree, and it's at the far west end of town, on the north side of the street, and there's a good deep depression behind the tree. Just to the right, as we saw in the picture, was the Bulletin, and this is an advertisement for the Bulletin office. You'll notice they don't say in their ad that they're cheap. Their advertisement only said, on as reasonable terms as any other newspaper office on the eastern slope of the Sierra, which wasn't saying very much. Each one of the local mining communities in Alpine County, Monitor, Markleyville, Silver Mountain, they all had their own separate papers. And the Bulletin was the first newspaper that operated here at Silver Mountain City. The competing Chronicle newspaper originally was located in Markleyville. The Bulletin folded up shop in 1867, however, as the mines in Silver Mountain took a little bit of a nosedive, and the Chronicle leaped at the opportunity to move to the county seat in Silver Mountain. The Chronicle's initial location, when it moved from Markleyville to Silver Mountain, was just up the block from the old Bulletin, and this was the first building at the corner of 2nd and Main. They moved around a bit. In later years, the Chronicle office moved between 1st and 2nd, and in about 1874, it moved up the block to the corner of 5th. But as you can see, this picture looks like it was a gala event with just about everyone in town showing up to have a picture taken, including the town dog. I'm guessing that this was the grand opening of the Chronicle when it first opened its doors in 1867. Two Quaker brothers ran the Chronicle, Robert and Alex Folger, and this was Alex. Robert was described as short and stout, and he ran the printing presses, and Alex, the younger brother, was tall and thin, and he wrote most of the articles. Together, as people would say, the Folger brothers made the long and the short of it. Together, Robert and Alex put out papers chronicling the daily life in Silver Mountain every week for the next 11 years. Articles in the paper ranged from the serious to the ridiculous and included topics like who should milk, man or woman, and how do you keep lice out of the hen house. There was news in their paper about the election of Lincoln and the Civil War battles in 1864, and they carried stories about the Great Fire in Chicago in 1871. But most of all, it printed news about the local mines. Ads included the great new consumer goods like Chickering pianos and that wonderful invention of sewing machine. But what really made money for the Folger brothers was its printing contract with the county as the official press, publishing county legal notices. So when bids were solicited for building that stone jail, they were published in the Chronicle. And if the mines weren't doing so well, there would also be assessment notices raising money from the shareholders and notices of delinquency against non-paying shareholders. It was all enough to keep the Folger brothers going, never really getting rich, but managing to hang on for 11 years. And thank heavens, because it is through the pages of their paper that so much of the information we have about Old Silver Mountain has survived. Down the street was the meat market, the Silver Mountain Meat Market. From 1864 to 68, a gentleman named Frank Dustay owned a butcher shop at the corner of 3rd, known as the Pioneer Meat Market. This was bought and sold several times, and in 1873, this market was called the Silver Mountain Market and was being operated by Robert K. Love, who also ran a similar one in Monitor. Imagine trying to run a meat market in the days before refrigeration. It may have been easy enough to keep the meat cool in the wintertime, but in hot summers, it would not keep very long, and it had to be sold fast. In Markleyville, the local butchers ran a meat wagon, taking freshly butchered meat to all the nearby towns of Monitor and Oleana. Goats were raised locally for both meat and milk, and sheep were particularly big business in Alpine County in the summertime and would be brought to the Alpine Meadows from the Central Valley to graze. And there were lots of sheep. In 1878, more than 100,000 sheep were grazing these hillsides. Sheep and cattle would regularly be brought right through Silver Mountain via the Big Trees Road. In December of 1867, for example, a pair named Christie and Davidson trekked through town with 125 head of sheep, and in 1868 they came through again with a band of beef cattle. As you can imagine, for the people who lived in town, having herds parading down your main street, your dirt main street, were a major nuisance, stirring up clouds of dust that landed on laundry that was hanging out to dry, and leaving behind unwelcome traces of their vistas. A bit farther down the block from the meat market was Ford's Hotel, another of the landmark establishments. A native of New Hampshire, Reverend R.H. Ford ran a hotel here beginning about 1870. It was officially called Alpine House, or less formally, just plain Ford's Hotel. It was at this hotel where a woman photographer named Eliza Withington stayed while she was in town taking stereopticon views. And if you've ever seen stereopticons, those are the ones that have two pictures on a card and you put them in a viewer, and the way the pictures are slightly offset gives the impression that you're looking at it in 3 dimensions. Eliza managed to take one really amazing photo of the jail being demolished in 1876, which we'll see in just a minute, but it was here at Ford's Hotel that she stayed while she was in town. Ford himself was a bit of a jack of all trades. He served as a local postmaster, he was a marrying and burying justice of the peace, he served as a county recorder and a school trustee, he served on the coroner's jury for poor Peter Peterson, and he even officiated as the minister at Peterson's funeral, which was graciously held right here at Ford's Hotel. His hotel served as the local stage stop, and it was the site of many local get-togethers and community events, including a gala down east Thanksgiving dinner for the whole town in 1871, and a May Day ball in 1872. Ford had a daughter named Anna, who set type for the Chronicle office when she was just 16 years old and became a school teacher. Anna grew up to marry the local judge named Indy Arnott in October of 1877. Arnott had just lost his first wife, leaving him a widower with a young son, so he was definitely a marriageable bachelor. Together, Anna and Indy went on to have 9 more children of their own. Descriptions of Anna suggest that she was sort of a take-charge type, and with 9 children, I imagine she also had quite a lot of patience. When Arnott was elected to be the local judge for the county in 1879, Anna and Judge Arnott moved from Silver Mountain down to Markleyville, which by then had become the county seat. As a married woman, Anna was no longer allowed to teach school, but she did continue her interest in schools and education, serving as the county's superintendent of schools. And during her tenure, the new wooden Markleyville schoolhouse on top of Schoolhouse Hill was chosen, and it was opened in October of '83. Ford's Hotel here in Silver Mountain burned down in that fire of '82, and Ford and his wife moved in briefly with Anna and Judge Arnott in Markleyville, eventually moving over to Ione. Ford himself lived to the ripe old age of 90, dying in 1900 in Ione. This handsome gentleman was Eric Erickson, who operated a saloon right next door to Ford's Hotel. About the time this picture was taken in 1872, Erickson would have been 43 years old, and he was a bit of a high roller. In one of the last acts of his life, he sent the newspaper a celebratory bottle of champagne in honor of Thanksgiving Day. But about 6 p.m. on the evening of December 17, 1872, a jealous husband named Ernst Roosh shot Erickson through the window of his own saloon with a double-barrel shotgun loaded with buckshot while Erickson was playing cards. Roosh, the fellow who shot him, was a Swedish sailor, and he had just married a lady named Emily Bergendahl here in Silver Mountain that August. Roosh had arrived in town just a week before the wedding to be married. As the newspaper tactfully put it, they had kept up a correspondence, and it is just possible that Emily was a mail-order bride. But 2 months after the wedding, Roosh was already posting a notice in the newspaper saying he would no longer be responsible for Emily's debts. Emily had apparently taken up with Erickson, who not only stole her away, but forbid Roosh the house, threatened his life, and continually abused him, as the newspaper put it. Although the shooting of Erickson was clearly murder, by and large, the townsfolk of Silver Mountain sympathized with Roosh. But the trial was to be held in nearby Mono County, and that would be horribly expensive for the new Alpine County. Roosh cooled his heels in Silver Mountain's cold stone jail for a year and a half while the proceedings dragged on, and finally, in April of '74, a lumber wagon with 4 horses, driven by saloon owner J. Davidson, and accompanied by about a dozen of the town's most prominent citizens, arrived at the jail and loaded up the prisoner, ostensibly to take him to Bridgeport for trial. It might have seemed just a little odd that Davidson and the wagon left Silver Mountain with their prisoner as late as 3 in the afternoon. The party stopped for dinner at about 5:30 or 6, and then hit the road again about 8 p.m. Again, a bit of an odd time of night to be traveling. Just outside Markleyville, the wagon was intercepted by a party of masked men who demanded the prisoner and took Roosh. Roosh was hanged from the south side of the bridge that now bears the name Hangman's Bridge, about 20 feet from the westerly end of the bridge. And when his body was discovered, it was lying in the water with the rope broken off. Also found at the scene were 6 black cloths with holes in them, 9 sacks, a ball of twine, and a green veil. when the coroner's inquest was held, one local citizen was questioned about a remark that he reportedly made upon finding the body. Here he is, just as we left him. Bruce was buried in Markleeville Cemetery at the top of the hill, and the masked men were never identified. The other thing that's not identified is Bruce's final resting place. And one of the things our museum is doing is trying to resurrect the graveyard at the top of the hill in Markleeville a little bit. It would be neat to know who's buried there, and we'll probably never know that, but at least we'll know where some of the graves are. Up the street from Erickson Saloon and almost back to the jail where we started was yet another saloon at the corner of Main and 4th. This one was run in 1866 by a gent named M.T. Gruenveld, and as you can see, boasted 2 first-class billiard tables as well as the best wines, liquors, and cigars. It was bought right about this time by another Silver Mountain entrepreneur named Thomas Ogden. Ogden was the one who proposed to rent a saloon to the county to serve as the courthouse in 1867. Mayans Exchange won that bid at first, but by 71 the board finally accepted Ogden's offer to use his saloon building for the court rent-free. Remember, Court Week was pretty good for business. Ogden's was a 2-story structure with another building attached in back, so the new county offices had plenty of room. The clerk and sheriff were both on the 2nd floor. The court was convened in the building in the back, and that conveniently left the saloon ready for business at all times. Ogden himself was apparently a bit of a scrapper. In 1867, Ogden accused another gentleman of stealing his watch, and the two got into a scuffle. During the fight, Ogden bit the offending party on the fingers, but according to Ogden, this was purely self-defense to save himself from having his eyes gouged out. The jury didn't buy his story, and he was found guilty of battery. In 1875, the county seat was officially moved from Silver Mountain to Markleeville, and slowly this once bustling town began to fade. In 1876, the old jail building was torn apart so that its expensive iron cells could be moved to Markleeville, and this is a picture capturing that very moment. This is the picture that photographer Eliza Withington managed to capture as the metal boxes were being pulled from the building. By the fall of 1878, even the devoted Folger brothers would throw in the towel, close up the Chronicle, and join the throngs that were moving to the new boom town of Bodie. Other former Silver Mountain residents, too, wound up making the move. The butcher, R.K. Love, for example, drove his whole band of hogs over the mountain and opened a new butcher shop also in Bodie. And even a few of the local buildings went with them. The Uncaffer house near Markleeville was disassembled and moved to the new town of Bodie, and as was the Macbeth Hotel for Monitor. Bodie, with 5,000 people, was booming, but Silver Mountain, however, was beginning to fade away. By the time of the mass exodus from Silver Mountain to Bodie in 1876, and just before the devastating Silver Mountain fire of 1882, the town looked like this. There was the tollkeeper's booth on the left, and on the right, there's the hulking Mammoth Hotel and its stable. You could just barely make out the Fisk Hotel on the left, a little bit past the tollkeeper station, before it was disassembled and moved to Markleeville in 1885. The street is still dirt, and although you can still see that it's still used, the town is pretty much fading away. Fast forward 130 years, and here we are. The buildings of Silver Mountain may be long gone, but our stories are still alive. And the biggest legacy that Silver Mountain has left behind is Alpine County itself. For without this amazing mining town, Alpine County would never have been born. Thank you for being here tonight.